everyone. I'm Lindsay Hosfield, and welcome to the second part of our Youngtimers Ask the Expert series on research participation, where we're talking to Dr. Randy Bateman from Washington University in St. Louis about topics surrounding clinical trial participation in the early onset familial Alzheimer's disease, or also known as the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease population. Dr. Bateman is the Charles F. and Joanne Knight Distinguished Professor of Neurology, Director of the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network, and Director of the DIAN Trials Unit. Dr. Bateman, thank you for joining us for the second series.
Of course, happy to, Lindsay. Thank you.
All right, let's jump right in. We left off our last conversation. You kind of set the scene for what kind of dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease is, how it's different from the more common late onset form of Alzheimer's disease. We talked about the importance of this disease in helping to develop therapies and diagnostic tools, one of which being biomarkers. So now I kind of just want to focus in on, more about research participation specifically. So can we talk about how the data collected from DIAN, so that's the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network clinical trials, is shared among researchers? I know you talked about how you generated all this biomarker data. You're looking at to see if there's drugs that actually change the course of the disease. So is that made available to the larger research community? Can you speak to us about that a bit?
Yeah. So the trials. Well, let's start with a few things about research in general.
Mm-hmm.
So many people may not know, but how does research happen? Who actually designs it? Who funds it? Who supports it? What's it being done for? I find sometimes it's helpful just to talk about some of the basics, because for people who don't do research, they may not know. And so when research is done, it's generally done by in a few domains. Scientific research, medical scientific research, especially for diseases, is typically done either what we call academics. So these are universities that are trying to generate new knowledge, new scientific discoveries that will help the understanding and help do things going forward. So universities around the world have a long history of developing new knowledge, of writing the textbooks of the things that we all learn in class. And more recently, companies, corporations have had a role in developing new knowledge. And a lot of times that's for the mission of the company. So if your company is a pharmaceutical company and your mission is to develop treatments, medicines, drugs that can be used to treat diseases, then you will set out and you will try to generate this new knowledge. For companies, many of them are private. They're privately owned or not in the public domain, whereas much of the research that's done at universities is in the public domain. And then, of course, I don't want to neglect, but there's government research. So the actual governments of countries do research themselves. And some governments, like ours, outsource a lot of the research to the universities. So what happens is those public funds come in and then they say, we need to do research. The National Institutes of Health in the United States is charged with doing research that helps people's health. And so they support a lot of the research that goes out. And significant funds are devoted to this creation of new knowledge, new understanding, new medicine that leads to the improved health of people. So then researchers at university, like myself and many, many others, will come up with some ideas, things that we think are important to know, ways that we think we can approach that with scientific studies or questions, and generate that and to share that with the world. That the goal there is to get that information out and widely distributed. So we might apply for grants to the NIH or other organizations. The money comes in to do the work is done, the information is shared with the scientific community and the larger world through several different mechanisms, the main one being scientific papers, manuscripts that come out in scientific journals of our findings. And so the
Which I can
Diane,
clarify, you can find, there it is a public domain, pubmed.gov if anybody's interested. And reading those, not all of, you know, universities have subscriptions to every journal, but usually you can ask your librarian for access to a journal if you're interested in a particular article. Just to clarify for anyone interested in reading those scientific articles.
a very important point. So let me emphasize the point, Lindsay, you just made, because this is really important. Anybody can go and find the scientific work that's done in this area. So you can Google search for PubMed, you can go there. There's lots of other ways of finding these manuscripts. You can go to libraries, you can get copies of them and PDFs. They're also talked about in a lot of different venues. There's a website that's one of my favorites is Alz Forum, alzforum.org.
I love that one
I
too.
really like, yeah, they're really highly accurate, very well done articles, very well curated, and you can go there and kind of find out. And it's the latest breaking stuff shows up there too. So there's lots of opportunities to get access to these contributions that are being made. And DIAN, the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network, is an NIH-funded study. So all of the research, all of the work that we do is publicly shared and sent to the world to use. And the DIAN-2 trials is what we call a public-private partnership. And what that means is that in the trials part, where we're trying to treat people with either an active drug or a placebo to see what the effects of the drug are, that information will also be shared because it's being supported with public funds. And the pharmaceutical partners that are a big part of this, the Alzheimer's Association and other groups, we've all come together to make this really a big public effort that can maximally inform the field about what the findings are. And that's really, I'll just emphasize the point that for DIAN and the DIAN-2, this is really important that the work that we do, the research that we do is publicly available. Because as we talked about, the families and the mutations are so instrumental in understanding Alzheimer's disease and hold so many of the keys that are needed to unlock the problem of how do we effectively treat and prevent it one day, that we need that information to be out there for everyone to use, that we can't tie that up in any kind of way. So that's a major principle of DIAN and the DIAN-2 trials, to how do we get this out to the large research community? By the way, speaking of resources, there's a DIAN website, and people can go to the DIAN website and you can read about the study, but you can also read about the latest work that's being done, the findings that are coming out in the DIAN studies, the DIAN observational study and the DIAN-2 trials. And so we post our findings, our papers, what's in the news, the latest things show up there. So there's lots to read there, and even some videos of some of the families in the research study. And we talked a bit about participating in research and things of that nature, but we have lots of information about that.
So let's say a researcher who's maybe not involved in the DIAN network, let's say they're interested in maybe looking at a particular gene, what does this gene do in the dyad population? Would they be able to contact DIAN and ask them, to be able to look at that gene? I mean, what does that process look like? Would that data be available to them?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We have, you're right on cue, on the website, that DIAN website, there's this thing there for investigators. It's a button, and I think they click it or something. And it gives them instructions for how to request data and even samples. So we talked the blood samples, the cerebrospinal fluid samples, even brain donations that are given are all carefully stored in a very uniform fashion from all over the world. These families are all contributing their samples, and they're all kept in one large, what we call a biobank, a biorepository. And so researchers from around the world can request these samples, receive them, and do their own analyses on them. Or in the case of a genetic study, the entire genomes have been sequenced. So if a researcher is looking for a particular gene or a variant of the gene, the data may already be there in this large data set, so they can request the data to do their analyses on, and then we can send them the data in a relatively short amount of time, and that helps accelerate research.
Mhm.
So it's one of the ways of how you can leverage kind of these studies to really get information and contribution samples to other researchers as quickly as possible.
Which is also probably why you need to take so much cerebral spinal fluid. There's, I think, quite a bit there. I was very surprised, around 30, I think, mils it was taken, but it makes sense now because you want to be able to distribute to as many researchers for all of their many different questions of all the different molecular mechanisms that are going on. So,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah, let me just comment on that. To date, there's more than 200 requests for Diane samples and data and things. And so that's been sent out. And researchers, I mean, literally dozens, a few hundred researchers are working on this with the contributions that have been made. So yeah, so we've built the thing to take what is safe and tolerated. We don't do spinal taps every week. We do them once a year, once every other year, and those samples then are used by the researchers. But it really makes a world of difference. I think the amount of research that's being done from this kind of study is it's just huge.
mm. Along these same lines, Diane has launched a new brain donation program, enabling donations to be allocated directly to Diane. Can you talk about this program and what studies are planned?
Yes, yeah, this is well, so two things. One is when Diane launched, we had a brain donation program as part of the Diane observational study. And what's very recent, over the past year, we've launched a Diane 2, that for the trials, we've launched a brain donation program for the trials. That's important for the same reasons the biorepository is that we want to have everything collected in the same way so it can be used in a study of a large collection of brain donations to help answer the questions. The final answer is in the brain. And so when we really need to understand what all our biomarkers mean, what everything else means, it's going to be in the brain. And so, as I was saying, the brain donation program is really an essential part to the entire study, the entire trials. All of our biomarkers, all of our cognitive clinical measures, we relate them back to the disease in the brain. And the ultimate answer is in the brain. And so that brain donation gift is one of the most powerful gifts that can be used in research and science.
Yeah.
The brains are very carefully analyzed in many different ways. And what it tells us is, in addition to the pathology, see the amyloid plaques and the tau tangles, and whether a drug changed the amyloid plaques and the tau tangles and how it changed it. We talked about the neurodegeneration, the loss of neurons in the brain. So how that's affected by the treatments is all critically important. Now, many of our centers, we've all been collecting and the brain donations to do studies on, research on for many years, decades. And those studies are all critically important. However, for the Diane 2 trial, one of the key things is that we need to understand how the drug treatments are affecting the Alzheimer's pathology. And one way to do that is we let every center kind of do their own protocols, collect the brain in their own way, process it, store it, analyze it. But it turns out that when you do that, it's very hard to make comparisons from one center to another center. So as part of the Diane 2 brain donation, the goal there is to have the brain donations done in a uniform way. And the research studies that are associated with this are all centered on us figuring out not just did the person have Alzheimer's and how much, but what effects did the drug have on the brain pathology, its progression in many different forms. So one of the things that's done is the brain donation is actually then shipped back to the central scanning unit, and it's actually scanned just as when we sit in the scanner and have the brain scanned. The brain is scanned again after the brain donation, and then it's compared directly to the scans that we had when the person was alive. The second thing that's done is the brain is carefully analyzed for the amount of pathology throughout the brain under what we call a uniform protocols. So if you have different ways of looking at it, you have one way to look at all the brain donations the same way, and that way you keep that the same. So if you see differences, you know the differences are due to whether the person had a drug or their stage of disease, and it's not due to the fact that it was processed differently. So for this reason, we have a policy in the DIAN-2 trials that all centers should participate in the DIAN-2 brain donation program, offer it to each participant who's in it, so that if they choose to, the individual can then volunteer to donate their brain for that program. Sometimes there's another program that's, the local center may have their own brain donation program. And in that case, we work with them to share tissue back to their centers so their research studies, as well as the DIAN-2 trial research studies, can both be met. And ultimately, what we hope to discover is how the drug is affecting its target. So in the case of the drugs that target the amyloid or the amyloid plaques, we can measure that directly within the brain. How does that compare to the PET scans that we had and the cerebrospinal fluid measures? And what does it mean for how what effects the drugs are having on the brain itself? There's also other measures that we look at. So for example, we know that in the case of one of the drugs, it removed plaques and also affected soluble tau measures. So did it affect the soluble tau in the brain? Did it affect insoluble aggregated forms of tau? Were there other parts that were affected? And the only way to know that is to look in the brain. So we are excited by the program. There have already been a number of donations and the research is already underway. People are already starting on this and making progress.
Yeah, as someone who's done research studies on postmortem brains, it really is tricky because, it depends what kind of formaldehyde you use, how long, it took before the brain was processed. I mean, all of that can really lead to variability. And when you're trying to test, especially for new molecules, and maybe the antibodies that you look to visualize those molecules, sometimes they don't work in the tissue because of the way they're processed. So it's really important that you have that uniformity when you're processing it. All right, so the next question, as engaged research participants, what can we do to continue to drive research efforts forward? At a previous conference, a participant asked how researchers and participants can better co-produce the creation of scientific knowledge and advance the fight against Alzheimer's disease. At the time, you said there are 3 ways. 1 is to stay involved in the study. Dropouts reduce the power of conclusions that can be drawn from the research currently underway. 2, recruit family to join the study who aren't currently participating. And 3, get involved in advocacy. Do you still support these action items, or are there others you would add to this list?
Yes, I do support all 3 of those action items. And maybe I'll take a moment just to expand on a couple of them. The one point that I made, point 1, which was to stay involved in the studies, turns out to be critically important. And the reason is that when someone comes in and they contribute, say, a set of data, they come in one time to the study, we know where that person is at that point in time. But it turns out the really important critical question is how do people change over time? And without that second and that third and fourth and fifth data points, we can't draw a line, right? We just have a point. And so that point, as important as it is, we really need people to keep coming back in the studies. This is amplified in a clinical trial where we're trying to understand what a drug is doing. Because there we're trying to see, does the drug actually improve the change over time when people are on a treatment versus when they're on placebo or a control person. So that's really critical. The second point is about numbers. And the family members, the people who are involved, have been outstanding advocates in reaching out to their own family and other families and bringing people in. The DIAN studies have grown tremendously and continue to do so. We're now welcoming new countries in the network in Central and South America, across Europe and other places. And so these new families that are coming into the network add substantially to the numbers of people that are there. And to the third point, advocacy, I think that's fair to share like what that could mean. So, Lindsay, what you're doing is a form of advocacy. You're supporting others, you're increasing awareness, you're sharing information, you have a group, you have a support group that helps, and a variety of things, including advocating for families, their individual needs, the clinical circumstances that people are in, dealing with issues like insurance and coverage and medication treatment, genetic counseling and family planning. These are all forms of advocacy. There's advocacy for science and research, and the advocacy groups have been doing a good job about sounding the alarms that we need more help, more support. The US government has responded in a very serious way to this financially with support for research. But that advocacy needs to continue. And the awareness that there are families out there that don't fit perfectly into the mold of Alzheimer's disease, that are too young to qualify for Medicare services, that there are unique issues to having a familial disease that extend beyond sporadic Alzheimer's disease. These things are important, and they need to continue to be brought to light and brought to awareness so that the appropriate kinds of response can be mustered by society.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, from the patients and the people in the community that I've interacted with, it's easier to deal with the disease when you feel like you have a sense of control over it, which is, I think, why they seek out, wanting to do 23andMe and sequence it, because maybe they'll find some clue, or maybe they'll pursue a specific diet, or take certain supplements because they want that control again. And I think it's just important to say that everything that you're asking them to do is what you believe will contribute to slowing or preventing their disease. And if there was some magic cure out there, that you would be one of the first ones to tell us what that is.
Absolutely, as soon
Yeah.
as we know. But just let me touch on that last point. I do think there are things that we can do that potentially help. And we don't know for certain, especially in the early onset dominantly inherited form of the disease, but we know from a lot of studies that a healthy lifestyle and a few specific things does seem to change the impact of the disease. And so the biggest things that we know of are things like aerobic exercise, eating right, being socially engaged, avoiding substance abuse problems like that. Anything that's generally really unhealthy for you is not good for your brain, and you don't want those two things confounding. But there is evidence that things like aerobic exercise, breathing hard and working out at least 3 times a week, can change the relative risk.
I think it was 120 hours a week, right? Can reduce your age of onset. I think it was 12 years, if I'm not mistaken.
There's lots of studies that try to estimate this.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a good handle. There's not yet. There's trials underway, but there's not yet global trials, and there haven't been in the younger population where we know exactly. But what we know is we know from association studies that if a person does real aerobic exercise, like you get your heart rate over 100 for 30 minutes a day for at least 3 days a week, we know for people who do that versus people who don't do that really at all, that they have a slower rate of progression by up to 50%, or they may have half the risk of getting late onset sporadic Alzheimer's. Now, that may be a cumulative effect over many years and decades. And as I said, we don't know how that directly translates to people with mutations. But, what I tell people is, look, it's healthy for you anyway. You get lots of benefits from it anyway. If you're in one of these families, definitely do that. Definitely exercise, live healthy, try to do the right things. It won't hurt. We also know it's not going to stop the disease. We know lots of people who are top-notch performance exercisers and athletes, and if they have the mutation, they do get the disease. And so we're looking for the stronger, more powerful treatments through science and modern medicine. But in the meantime, it certainly doesn't hurt to try to implement these things in your life.
And kind of along those same lines, talking about trying to slow or prevent the disease. So that kind of leads us into my next question, which In Colombia, a report recently identified that a presenilin-1 mutation carrier, so this is an early onset familial dominantly inherited mutation, a person carrying that mutation remained cognitively intact into late age. So this was 30 years after her family's expected age of onset. We have heard of the existence of other escapees, but what was interesting about this woman is that she had high levels of amyloid in her brain with limited tau. Based on this finding, and that most therapies up until now have focused on reducing A beta in the brain, are Alzheimer's disease researchers and Diane thinking about approaching pharmaceutical therapies differently, and how?
Yes. And we already have done that even before. And by the way, that person from the Colombian kindred that was described had a double, not just the mutation that causes the disease, but she also had a double mutation in a totally different gene, ApoE, that seems to confer a protective risk factor for ApoE called the Christchurch mutation. She had two copies of that. And so really 1 in a billion, this is so rare that it's really incredible that it existed, but it's a good case in point that it's possible that with certain kinds of changes that you might be able to prevent the disease. And so with that, what we're now looking to do is to try to ask that question, which is how did that person resist the disease for 30 years before she started to show symptoms? And what does that have to do with the rest of it? Well, we've known for a number of years that tau seems to be a critical factor. Some people have called it the executioner of Alzheimer's disease, and that it's a critical factor in the expression of the disease and how it manifests with symptoms. And based on the growing evidence for that and other advances in the field, we were able to design and now offer what's called the Tau Next Gen trial as part of the Diane2 platform. And that trial is enrolling now in what's called a cognitive run and an entry portion to it. And we're going to be offering 3 tau drugs. In fact, we're expecting to make the announcement of the first tau drug here within a few months. And with that, we are going to be targeting tau. And the concept here is we still believe amyloid is a good target. We still believe using it for prevention is good. But we don't think that by itself will completely stop the disease. So we don't want to stop at amyloid. And we've moved on to tau. And we're going to be launching tau. And someday, maybe someday soon, we'll be asking the question, what about amyloid and tau? And can we do both in the same person? And there are certain things that are required to be able to do that. But that is at the forefront of our minds, because as we started our conversation, Alzheimer's is a disease, is a tale of 2 proteins, amyloid and tau. And we think we really have to address both in order to be able to maximally treat it. And so we are looking to that and how to do that.
This was one of the participants' questions. We have 2 questions left. And I think it's important because of kind of the recent FDA decision regarding aducanumab, which is an amyloid, a monoclonal antibody. So do you think the FDA's decision will affect gantenerumab or similar drugs that are in the Diane pipeline?
I think any decision the FDA makes about any drug will affect all research that's ongoing. I don't think that's an overstatement. And by the way, the decision hasn't been made. It's been postponed.
Delayed for 3 months.
Delayed
Yeah.
till June. And if the FDA, let's say the FDA approves and in what way they approve it and how other countries look at that data and what other countries do matters a lot to us. Certainly within the US FDA will have an impact on research in general. Other countries will have to also make their own decisions about any proposed treatment. As you may know, the gantenerumab has its own phase 3 clinical trials, and there are other trials that are coming out. There's recent announcements that another drug that removes plaques we haven't seen the data, but seems to have had some benefit for patients in terms of their cognition. And so the question then becomes, how many of these drugs and what will the landscape look like and it's complex. There's a lot of moving parts there and things to consider, such as the trial that demonstrated a beneficial effect from one drug, can that be translated to a different population, such as dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease, where maybe amyloid production is higher and the amyloid burden is higher? Can treatments be used at different stages of disease? So if it's used in mild AD, shown to have a benefit there in early AD, can it be used in prevention modes? And what does that mean? And that's what we're testing in the gantenerumab open label extension. So in that part of the study, what we're doing is everybody's receiving gantenerumab, and we're seeing what effects removing amyloid has in that part of the study. And then there's issues of access to the medications, payments, who's going to cover the expenses, will insurance companies cover it, and how that'll happen. It's a very complex topic. I would say that I don't have a clear idea of precisely what's going to happen and how that'll impact it, but it's going to be complex, and there'll be a lot of action and reaction to that. There's also the possibility that it's approved in a limited way.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean for the population? These are all things that we have to work out. I think any decision, I'll just reiterate, any decision that happens in the world of approved therapies will impact our treatments, our treatment trials, our research, our studies. The observational study, right, will be impacted as well. And so as part of that, that's all part of advancement, right? And that's a necessary part of it. So part of that is us planning and thinking about how do we then design the next study or adapt the current study to maximally utilize that to further the understanding in science. And this is what we want to see happen. We want to see things reach a threshold that we think there's some benefit, and then how do we further that? Of course, what we don't want is we don't want it to undermine and stop all research, stop all advancement, because we don't think that these single treatments are the final answer for Alzheimer's disease. They're not going to, even in the best of scenarios, they don't stop the disease. The disease progresses. And so, so we need to think about, what is the best way now to leverage that to try to have the biggest impact we can for families and patients.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. And I think also to add, the way that aducanumab was studied and the research and the data that was generated, I think is different than what was found for gantenerumab, even though they're the same class of drugs. And so for me, I'm hopeful, about gantenerumab because of the results that we do see in the DIAD cohort with that treatment. So, and that, those results are really striking, and maybe aducanumab doesn't reach that level and it might not get approved, but I have hope still for gantenerumab. And I think it's important to also just note that although these are the same class, they're hitting different forms of A beta, and it's working out what specific form you need to hit to make a difference and remove it from the brain. So just because it's a specific class doesn't mean it does the exact same thing as another drug. So
that's for sure true, Lindsay.
All right. Our final question. Given the recent events in the United States regarding inclusion and diversity, can you speak about how Diane and the Alzheimer's field are making efforts to increase diversity and access to clinical trials for minority populations?
Yes, yeah, that is it, and that's been, it's been an area, by the way, that's been under focus for a long time. The recent events, I think, have really accentuated and highlighted some of the important needs that the research field in general, and Alzheimer's being part of that, needs to focus on. And perhaps we can even talk about stakeholders, because the question embedded in that question is the access to clinical trials for minority populations. But in fact, there are other areas where equity is not ideal. And so we need to think about that and focus on that too. So I'll start with the specific question, which is access to clinical trials. In Diane and the Diane 2 trials, our problem perhaps is the opposite. There are so few people who are at risk for one of these mutations in the family. I mean, literally less than 1 in a million. So we're searching for the needles in the haystack, so to speak, looking for the rare family that carries one of these mutations. We're desperate to have anybody from a family come in, okay? And so we go to great lengths to reach people. Um, Far and wide, we deliver the medications to people's homes, we outreach, we fly tracers in, we fly people around, we do everything we can to have every opportunity so that each eligible and interested participant can participate. And some of this is a lot of work, and sometimes it takes time. There's some regions in the world where we haven't been able to start as quickly as we wanted to, and we've had to invest significant resources in really trying to get there, get up to speed, to start the studies, and to get approvals there. So we've gone to great lengths to try to have near 100% inclusion of all family members. But that's not really the issue that you're referring to. The issue you're referring to is about uh, inequity between populations of people. And as a general field in Alzheimer's and in research in general, I think we haven't been able to do or have not done as good a job at that, maybe is what we've been able to do in Diane and Diane 2 with outreach and expending enormous resources to try to reach every person. Um, and there are real issues with that. And the key ones is that we're studying a disease that affects Alzheimer's does not discriminate against race, sex, gender, anything else. It affects everybody, everyone. There's not a person on this planet who is not at risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so because of that, we need to study it in everyone and study it equitably, evenly across all groups of people. And that's something we haven't, as researchers, done as good a job about in the late onset sporadic form. And it's for a variety of reasons. Some of those are institutionally based, and they're where the medical centers are and who they recruit. A lot of it, I think, is bias and volunteering and coming in. And a lot of it falls on our research side of the researchers in communicating and making the effort and the outreach to reach people who normally aren't the people who are volunteering. And we know there's biases in our study. Many of our research participants in our studies are highly educated. They're very involved. They come in and there's certain high socioeconomic status. But that's not the general population. And so we need to do better to reach the representative population. This is a dual mandate. It's not just for societal equity reasons, which are critically important. Scientifically, this is a mandate, right? Medically and scientifically, we need to have everyone included. And to increase the diversity and have equal representation, it's really our job to do the outreach, to do the work, to invest the resources needed to have that. It's been too easy to not do it the other way. And so I think there's definite room for improvement. I do think it'll take additional resources, more work, more people. We're going to have to change the way we do things. But it's happening now. The change is there. I see it happening across all fields of Alzheimer's research. One of the things we did in St. Louis a few years ago due to this scientific question was we knew that the blood test that we had developed worked really well in research populations. We had run it in multiple international groups, and the performance was great. But we actually didn't know how it worked in the general population. And so we submitted a grant saying, yes, the test works great, but we don't know how it works in people who have lower socioeconomic status, low education, cancer, insulin-dependent diabetes, people from other races, other racial distributions than what we had access to. And so the point was, we really have to test it there. We have to know, because this test is going to be presumably applied to all people. And so we started a study. It's St. Louis based, it's local. It's called the Seabird study, but we set out to reach out to the general population in a representative way. And one of the things that helps with that, and this is partly a technological advancement, is with a blood test, it's easier to sign up. You're not signing up for a spinal tap and blood collection and brain scans and cognitive and clinical tests and agreeing to do this year after year. The only requirement was come in, let us draw a sample of blood, ask you some questions, and then the other parts are all optional. And that lowers that bar, that threshold to come in, and makes it easier. So some of this can be addressed with technological advancements like blood tests to make it easier for people to participate. But I think a good part of this really needs to be effort, and it needs to be, we need to hold ourselves to the standard of our studies will be based on the population, which one day will benefit from the research, and that's everybody. That's an inclusive policy, and as I said, I really think that change. I've been very impressed over the past year in the changes that I've seen across our field in Alzheimer's and other areas, and really paying attention and doing dedicated work in that area.
Well, I think that's a great way to end our discussion today. Thank you again, Dr. Bateman, so much for your time, and also just for your dedication to this disease. I think I speak for all of us within this community that we're just so grateful that we have you on our team.
Well, I'm certainly delighted to do it. And Lindsay, I just want to say just a last comment then. Recently, I was notified that one of the family members that we knew had passed away from the disease, and it's a terrible disease. We hear this all the time, and we lose people over time, and so it's that close connection with the families, and having them be part of this research, partnership in this research, that really is a driving and motivating force for us. So what I would say is part of that, maybe getting back to that advocacy point, stay in touch with your researchers, stay in touch with not just the coordinators, but introduce yourselves to the principal investigator at your site, talk to people and let them know what it means to you to have that, because I can tell you that is a great fuel, a great transformational drive that for us as researchers, as doctors, and for many other people, for people in the government, for people in companies. I've seen this make massive changes there, transformational changes. And so, Lindsay, I think what you're doing and what others are doing in terms of the outreach and the communication is very essential to this whole process. And I think it's the fuel that drives the engine. So stay with us and we'll keep going, and one day we will have a day without Alzheimer's.